Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching with second-year Ziegler rabbinical student, Blum.
This morning we read Parashat Yitro, which contains the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, often rendered in English as commandments. About 15 minutes ago, let's say, we read from next week's parasha, Mishpatim. The first law in this parasha, especially as it juxtaposes with the 10 commandments, fundamentally challenges our understanding of Torah, of Hashem, and indeed of the Exodus itself, obfuscating the path ahead and making the road a harder walk. These are the laws you shall set before them. When you purchase a male Hebrew slave, 6 years he shall work for you, and on the 7th he shall go free without payment. Just to orient ourselves, I'll tell you that the speaker here is Hashem. 5 verses previous, which will be on page 449 in the Etz Chaim if you want to follow along there, Exodus 20:19 begins, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. As a matter of fact, the monologue from which I drew this verse is literally the first thing God says after delivering the 10 commandments. This verse is the 6th verse, which is on page 456 after the Haftarah in your Etz Chaim. The fact that God says this immediately after the 10 commandments, again, deeply troubles me. We just had our first receipt of law by God. We read a few weeks ago at the start of Shemot how slavery under Egypt was this deeply terrible, bitter, painful thing. And now God appears to condone that we should enslave fellow Hebrews. So what is the deal with this law? Why does it exist? What are the initial thoughts and reactions that we have? Anybody? Yeah, Marissa.
A charitable interpretation would say maybe this is not the same kind of slavery as the Israelites were having under the Egyptians. This is time-bound. It's only 6 years. It's not in perpetuity. But that's a very kind reading,
so it's
I think.
More like an indentured servitude type of thing. You also had your hand up. Joel.
I was going to say basically the same thing.
I'm going to say basically the same
thing. It was just
thing.
an improvement over what was there.
Mm-hmm.
Baby steps.
Baby steps. So I had a similar reaction. I had a couple of thoughts. One, thinking about the Torah historically, and in terms of the redaction of the Torah, perhaps its placement is coincidental. This is just the way the Torah came together, with the different sources being piled, and it just so happens that these two sources wound up next to each other. Another answer, the Torah is saying that slavery was only bad when the Egyptians were doing it because they treated their slaves harshly, but if you treat your slaves well or under different circumstances, then it's fine. I don't particularly like that answer. 3, the verse says, when you purchase, not you must purchase. One could choose not to take a slave at all, while one could view the phrase, when you take, as the Torah assuming slavery to be a given in society. The wording could be, if you take. The word ki, in this case, probably means closest to for. These are the laws you shall set before them. For acquiring a Hebrew slave, these are the laws, 6 years, and so on and so forth. Again, not super comfortable, but that's the best that I can think about so far. We go on. And if the slave says, not saves, I love my master and my wife and children, I will not go free, his master shall hand him over to God, he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. So my question now is, why would anyone want to go through with this process? Why do you think the Torah wants Israel to distinguish between slaves who have chosen freedom after going through their contract versus slaves who want to remain enslaved? Adrian?
I would say that the distinction is made because slavery is portrayed as like the worst fate. We are a people that has gone free. We fought very hard for our freedom. It was a large schlep, right?
Yeah.
Not large, long schlep to get out. And Torah is like, if you really want to do that, I guess you can, but you're going to be stuck forever.
You read ahead.
Did I read ahead?
That's exactly where I'm sort of thinking. That's where my head is at right now, at least in this portion of the source sheet. There's comfort in slavery. That's what we were doing in Egypt, so it makes sense to go with something that is comforting and familiar. Even though the Hebrews are now free to worship the God of Israel and will enjoy a degree of freedom in the Promised Land, the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt for, again, 210 years. This process with the all allows for some degree of freedom, since slaves are still somewhat of a protected class with certain rights in Torah, but not too much freedom. So this, again, raises the question, would you rather be free or safe? In this sort of regard, you're getting the Jews out of Egypt, but you're not getting the Egypt out of the Jews. Ibn Ezra comments on the first two words of Exodus 21:5. But if the servant shall plainly say, this is what im amar means, our sages have already explained that his ear is not pierced unless all these conditions, including because he loveth thee and thy house, which comes from Deuteronomy later on, have been fulfilled. So Ibn Ezra seems to think that the sages think the process to remain a slave was deliberately harder, so that no one could accidentally remain a slave. The second word in the phrase from which Ibn Ezra draws amar is from a form that is known as the infinitive absolute. The only thing you need to know is that when it's next to a verb that's the same root in another form as it is in Exodus 25, if you look above, amar yomar, most of the time it intensifies the meaning, hence plainly say. Most famously in Genesis, when God says not to eat of the tree of life, it's mot yumat. Lest you surely die. So in this case, amar yomar could be if the slave super duper says that he wants to remain a slave, do X, Y, and Z. Before I ask if anybody has any other interpretations of Ibn Ezra, I'm going to argue that the Torah wants to distinguish between former slaves who are freemen and slaves who are slaves in perpetuity to make the choice towards slavery almost a kind of deterrent. There is a physical mark, much like how cows have the tag on their ears. It's made deliberately humiliating and painful so that others will see it and know and move away from slavery because it's just humiliating to have that mark, so they might as well not do it. And in this way, it's sort of meant to dissuade from the whole enterprise altogether. Does anybody have any other interpretations of Ibn Ezra, real quick? Yes, Marissa.
I don't know if it's Ibn Ezra. Maybe I'm jumping ahead or backwards to the couple verses before 21:5-6, where it's talking about this slave having a wife and children.
Yeah.
And I feel like that can be a really heavy impetus. You know, you want to stay with your family.
Exactly. So, because you mentioned that, let's take a look at how the Torah tries to dissuade the slave from remaining a slave at all, at least now from the perspective of a slave master. If the slave comes by himself he shall leave. If he had a husband and wife, his wife shall leave with him. If the master gave him a wife, and she bore him sons or daughters, the wife and children shall belong to the master, and he lives alone. So, according to the Torah, the wife is essentially a rental to her slave husband, and that is awful. She doesn't actually enter into her husband's house. Any children she may have with her husband remain slaves, irrespective of whether or not the husband chooses to go free or not. Would this not encourage a man to remain a slave so he can remain remain a slave so he can remain with his wife? If these laws are meant to be a deterrent, why this formulation? So a potential answer: you can have multiple wives regardless of whether or not he wants to remain a slave. This is before the ban on plural marriage, but she is screwed until he dies or gives her a get. But because the prospect of never seeing your wife or child again, or seeing them seldomly since they're working as slaves, is deliberately cruel, I think the cruelty here is the point. By making slavery as an enterprise, as a whole thing, so cruel and unfair, it prevents anyone from wanting to enter into that contract to begin with. So it closes the doors before they're even opened. And it forces them to confront and live in freedom, which is ultimately alien to them, but will be better in the long run. And just for time, I want to really push through. I want to look at one last set of laws that seem to be in concordance with how I'm thinking, but again, from the perspective of a slave trader. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as male slaves go free. If something bad about her be in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. To an alien people he may not sell her, since he acted treacherously with her. And if for his son he designated her, according to the judgment of free daughters, he shall deal with her. If he takes another wife, her food, her clothing, and her conjugal rights he may not withhold. And if these things he does not do for her, he shall go free without silver. I think it's interesting that you have chinam in previous verses. In this verse, you have kesef, but it comes down to the same thing. You're not giving them any payment. But the part that interests me is, why are there so many more laws here when dealing with female slaves as opposed to male slaves? And why does her marital status matter? Now, based on my view of Ibn Ezra, only if a slave meets 3 conditions does he have the option to remain a slave. However, in this case, we have a negative formulation. If the person does not do these 3 things, she may go free. In other words, if one of these things is lacking, the clause which would grant her freedom is activated. Again, it's making things deliberately difficult and deliberately cruel, such that people look at slavery and say, no, I don't want to do that again. It's too complicated. I would much rather have the freedom where there's actually less rules. I wanted to conclude with a bit of Maimonides, and I'll turn it over to somebody else to read that bit, because it's quite a lot. Do we have any volunteers to read? Okay, Paige, you can read.
Human nature cannot simply drop everything familiar all at once. The familiar mode of worship during the time of the Torah meant only sacrificing animals. So with the grace and wisdom throughout all creation, God's law did not simply unknown, reject and abolish such worship. Human nature, always so attached to the familiar, could not conceive of accepting such law. It would have been the same in those days if some prophet today, in calling people to serve God, were to say, God forbids you to pray, fast, or call on him in distress. How could such weighty commands and prohibitions not be for their own sake, as if God tricked us to reach his real goal? What would keep him from giving us the laws he wanted in the first place? The Torah tells quite a like story when it says God led them not through the land of Philistines, although it was closer for God, and said, let the people have change of heart when they said war and returned to Egypt. So God led the people the long way around, though the wilderness by the Sea of Reeds. Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 through 18. He diverted them from the main route to their destination, mindful of the natural physical limitations in the some way, mindful of their spiritual limitations. He laid down the law that I cited in order to achieve his prime intent, that they come to know him and give up pagan worship. Just as our human nature does not lead one grown up in slavery amidst clay, bricks, and such, then just wash one's hands and go straight into battle against the sons of Anak. Numbers chapter 13, 28. Human nature does not let one grow up with all sorts of religious rites and then suddenly drop them. God showed grace in having Israel wander until their spirits grew hardy, and a new generation rose that was unused to servitude and abasement.
Any thoughts on Rambam before I conclude for time's sake?
You're welcome.
Yeah, Adrian.
I kind of agree with it, and I see it as like a reason why the conversion process is so long. because I think the rabbis recognized that they recognized this very thing. You can't just drop everything all at once. Yeah. You have to make adjustments and get used to the life that you are going to live.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Play the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
This makes me think of sort of apologetics or rationalizing why we should have slavery. So God or the Torah in many, many places says, you shall not. And we stopped, whether it was child sacrifice or anything else. I think this possibly could have been a way to support the economic benefits of exploiting people. And so just like many of the people who wrote at the time trying to justify slavery in the South, I think that it might be easy to say that they were trying to ease them out of it. But the amount of time spent in the Torah, just these pasukim, and there are many more, about slavery leads me to think that it was a way to make it palatable but keep it in place.
Interesting. Yes, Rabbi Berenbaum.
I want to suggest two things. I want to go back to the verse that if a slave has a wife and children. The interesting thing in and I've studied slavery as a modality of the slave for the master is considered a capital investment. Mm-hmm. And a capital investment that procreates produces additional capital investment. Mm-hmm. The equivalent of if my Kia could back up to your Mercedes and produce a Chevrolet every night, that's what they would be doing. The question then becomes whether in this case, the male Hebrew slave has bought into the idea that all of this is capital and whether indeed what he has there is relational. Mm-hmm. Because in the form of slavery we had in the American South, there was no recognition of family. Mm. And consequently, you could trade your slave without having any responsibility for family because the slave was regarded as a capital investment. And that made it so that here the male slave is recognizing a wife and children, meaning that he's entered into a relationship which for his master is merely a utilitarian means to increase his capital and to take the time to wait for the capital to grow up and become useful, etc., etc. So there's a peculiar achievement here in terms of the humanity of the male slave. And in other cases of slavery, there was no recognition. You were just doing your master's bidding, and you had no responsibility onward because the slave was responsible for supporting the woman. The master was responsible for supporting the woman. The master was responsible for supporting the offspring because he saw them as future capital investment. So it's there. The other thing is this played a very important role in the history of America when you had a challenge during the Civil War or in the era preceding the Civil War, whether the Bible did prohibit or permit slavery. There were a whole range of people, rabbis and pastors among them, who came to the conclusion slavery was wrong, but the Bible doesn't prohibit it. And when people invoked that the Bible prohibited slavery, they said, what is it about the Bible that you're not reading? And it became a pivotal point of confrontation in terms of interpreting biblical text. And it's interesting to see these debates where and what makes it interesting is, and here certainly I'm on the side of those who would say that slavery is prohibited and we should not have slaves, but it's interesting the convolutions that people took to come to their preordained conclusions.
So I'll use that as a point to conclude. It's clear from Maimonides, our preeminent 12th century legal scholar and commentator, that he's only talking about the laws of sacrifices, right? He mentions pagan worship regarding his idea that God presented a perfect, imperfect version of his vision in the Torah, so that way the Hebrews would not immediately reject him, but embed within Torah hints to give Israel a nudge toward the ideal vision. But here's the rub. I think the same concept applies here, and that's why the laws of slavery are right next to the Ten Commandments. It's a deliberate choice. We have freedom, and here are the laws now that we are free, but we can't forget that we were slaves. And so putting the laws of slavery next to what I'll term the laws of freedom, the Torah wants us to live in that cognitive dissonance and eventually overturn and outlaw the practice of slavery. Moving more broadly, in each moment, with each law, God offers us a choice. We may find those laws challenging or at times completely opposed to our modern sensibilities, such as the laws regarding slavery. It's like a GPS. And the destination is ahead and unclear, but it's been set. We make a left turn, God recalculates and offers us another choice. You make a right turn, same thing. But in this way, God is not transcendent, giving a constitution and then sealing God's self away, leaving us to sort out the particulars, but God is with us, immanent, and at each breath. We are unfolding the future with God. We renew creation with God. How do we survive Sinai, as the title of this lecture is, or the shiur is given? It's not a moment, singular, from which we've moved on and expound interpretations across centuries. It's a mountain we ascend and descend every day. And when the derech, the path, is not clear, the Torah asks, as it does here, what do you want to be? What kind of people do you want to become? Where do you want to go? That's the beauty of Torah as an eternally relevant document. Getting to the destination may take a while. You may have to go roundabout, as Maimonides says, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we will get there. And all we have to do is take steps together. I wanted to thank the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who provided the little nugget from which this shiur was adapted. He suggested that the laws of slavery were, again, made confusing as a way to give Israelites a push toward out of slavery and a push to get the Egypt mindset out of the Jews.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.